Welcome to all who have stopped to listen to this story. What you are about to witness is a tale from times past that brings deep reflections on dignity, the true value of beauty, and the courage to love when the entire world forbids it. A story that, although set in the 18th century, will resonate in your hearts as if it had happened yesterday. But before we begin, I would love to know, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. And if you value these stories that I try to share with so much affection, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe and leave your like, so we can continue this journey together. Toledo, Spain, 1773. The sky over Toledo was dissolving into copper tones when Mateo Sanchez, with his 28 years, carried on his back like sacks of freshly harvested wheat, heard the sentence that would change the course of his existence. His rough hands, silent witnesses to endless days in the Castilian fields, twisted under the invisible weight of a false accusation. He had not stolen that gold ring in the mayor's house, but the judge's words now fell upon him like stones thrown from above. Mateo Sanchez, you are sentenced to serve in the palace of Santa Clara until His Majesty decides otherwise. The silence that followed was so thick it could be cut with the same dagger the constable carried on his belt. In the small room, impregnated with the smell of candle wax and old wood, Mateo kept his gaze fixed on the worn stone floor. His dignity, the only thing that could never be taken from him, prevented him from begging. The judge, Don Bernardo, a man with watery eyes and chubby hands, adorned with rings, how ironic, avoided meeting the eyes of the condemned. Outside life continued. Vendors hawked their wares in the market square, the cathedral bells marked the inexorable passage of hours, and children played oblivious to the injustice being committed just a few meters from their laughter. For Toledo, it was just another day for Mateo. It was the end of one life and the forced beginning of another. That night, in the damp cell where he awaited his transfer, Mateo contemplated through a small barred window how the stars seemed to mock his misfortune, so distant and indifferent. His thoughts flew to his small hut on the outskirts, to the fields he had worked since childhood, to the smell of freshly ploughed earth after the rain. What will become of me in that palace? He wondered, as his fingers traced invisible drawings on the stone wall. Rumors about Santa Clara spoke of a place as beautiful as it was relentless, where servants were little more than shadows, condemned to move in perpetual silence. When the first ray of sunlight slipped through the window, drawing a golden rectangle on his cell floor, Mateo understood that freedom like light could be present, yet remain unreachable. The carriage advanced along the rocky road with the same resolution as an executioner toward the scaffold. Through the small window, Mateo watched as the landscape transformed. The arid fields of Castile gave way to carefully designed gardens, a preview of the artificial beauty that awaited him. After 2 days of travel, the palace of Santa Clara rose before him like an apparition from another world. Built of stone so light that it seemed to shine with its own light, its elegant columns and proud towers defied the sky. It was a place conceived to remind mortals of their insignificance. The coachman, a man of few words and fewer smiles, stopped the carriage in front of a side door, far from the main entrance reserved for nobles and dignitaries. "We've arrived," was all he said, before gesturing brusquely for Mateo to descend. A butler of indescribable age waited at the entrance. His face, an impenetrable mask, carved by years of service, betrayed no emotion upon receiving the new servant. "Mateo Sanchez," he said in a monotone voice. It wasn't a question, but the confirmation of an inevitable fact. "Yes, sir," Mateo replied, trying to maintain dignity in his voice, though he felt tiny before the magnificence of the palace. "I am Esteban, head butler. Follow me." They traversed endless corridors decorated with tapestries depicting battles and hunts halls, where light filtered through colored glass, creating impossible patterns of light on marble floors and stairs, so wide they seemed designed for giants. The silence was absolute, barely broken by the echo of their footsteps and the occasional whisper of curtains moved by invisible air currents. "At Santa Clara," Esteban explained without turning, "we serve the royal family directly. You have been assigned to the personal service of Princess Isabel, daughter of His Majesty King Carlos, and heir to the throne." Mateo's heart skipped a beat. The princess. He, a simple peasant, accused of theft at the service of the future queen. The rules are simple. Esteban continued, stopping in front of a dark wooden door carved with floral motifs. Never look directly at the princess. Never speak unless requested. Never touch her belongings without explicit permission. He paused, and for the first time his grey eyes bored into Mateo's. And above all, never under any circumstances mention the veil. The veil! The question escaped Mateo's lips before he could contain it. A shadow crossed the butler's face. You'll understand soon enough. Now these will be your quarters. Rest today. Tomorrow you will begin your duties at dawn. That night, lying on a bed more comfortable than he had expected, but infinitely lonelier, Mateo felt he had entered a world where every gesture had weight and every word had consequences. Through the small window of his room, he could see part of the gardens illuminated by the moon. On a distant balcony, he thought he glimpsed a solitary figure wrapped in dark garments, motionless as a statue facing the night. As sleep claimed him, a question danced in his mind. What secrets did the palace of Santa Clara hide behind its marble walls and courtly smiles? The first time Mateo saw Princess Isabel, the world seemed to pause for an instant. He was in the royal chambers preparing to light the fire in the fireplace as instructed, when the door opened without warning. Doña Teresa, the lady, in waiting, entered first, a woman with a sharp face and watchful eyes that seemed to register every detail of the surroundings. And behind her, like a shadow born from the twilight itself, appeared the princess. Isabel of Bourbon and Savoy, heir to the throne of Spain, walked with the natural elegance of one who carries royalty in her blood. Her dark blue silk dress whispered against the floor like confidences exchanged between lovers. Her hands, white and delicate, emerged from lace like winter flowers. But what captured Mateo's attention, what made his heart stop for a second, was the veil. Black as a starless night, so thick that it was impossible to guess her features, the veil completely covered the princess's face, descending almost to touch her chest. It was not a simple adornment, Mateo understood, but a deliberate barrier, a frontier, between her and the world. Remembering the instructions, Mateo immediately lowered his gaze, concentrating on the nascent flames that began to lick the logs. But even without seeing her, he felt Isabel's presence in the room, the slight jasmine perfume that accompanied her, the soft sound of her breathing, the tension that seemed to emanate from her like an invisible field. "Is he new?" the princess asked. Her voice, unexpectedly melodious, contrasted with the rigidity of her figure. "Yes, Your Highness," Doña Teresa responded with a curtsy. "Mateo Sanchez, he arrived yesterday from Toledo. He replaces Miguel." There was a silence during which Mateo felt the weight of an invisible gaze through the veil. "Good," Isabel finally said. "Let him finish with the fire and withdraw." That night, during dinner in the palace kitchen, Mateo heard for the first time the rumors circulating among the servants. Seated in a corner with a plate of stew in front of him, he sharpened his ears when he heard the princess mentioned. "They say she's mad," whispered a young maid to another, covering her mouth with her hand, as if the walls could hear. "That's why she hides." "Don't talk nonsense," replied an elderly cook, drying his hands on his apron. "She's not mad, she's cursed. I saw her face once years ago before the veil. There are things best not remembered." "What she is lonely," intervened a third voice belonging to an older woman Mateo hadn't seen before, so lonely that silence has become her only companion. When the servants noticed Mateo listening, they fell silent, giving him warning glances. The message was clear: the palace secrets must remain as such, buried under layers of silence and fear. That night, as he lay in his narrow bed, Mateo remembered the slender figure of the princess, the dignity with which she wore that black veil, and wondered what kind of pain could make someone hide from the world like that. Somehow, that veiled woman reminded him of the statues of saints covered during Holy Week in his village, figures of hidden suffering that in some way were more moving precisely because of what could not be seen. Outside, the moon illuminated the palace gardens, and somewhere, in that fortress of stone and secrets, the princess of the Black Veil perhaps also contemplated the night so close, and yet as distant as the stars themselves. The days at the Palace of Santa Clara slid by like beads on a rosary, identical in appearance, but each with its small distinctive mark for those who knew how to look. Matteo quickly learned the invisible choreography of service, when to be present and when to disappear, how to anticipate needs without being noticed, how to exist without really existing. One afternoon, while organizing firewood for the fireplaces in a shed near the gardens, a voice broken by the years surprised him. "You're the new one, the one who serves the princess." Matteo turned to find an elderly woman bent like a willow by the weight of years. Her eyes, however, retained a vivacity that contrasted with her fragile body. "Yes, ma'am," Matteo responded slightly, inclining his head in a sign of respect. "Doña Margarita," she introduced herself, sitting with difficulty on a stool by the door. "I served in this palace for 50 years until my bones decided it was enough." There was something about the old woman, a mixture of dignity and closeness, that made Matteo immediately feel at ease. "I've been watching you," she continued. "You have the look of someone who seeks to understand, not just see. And I've seen you looking at the princess, without looking directly at her, of course." Matteo felt his cheeks flush. "I'm only fulfilling my duty, ma'am." "Doña Margarita," she gently corrected him, "and curiosity is not a sin, boy, although in this palace it sometimes seems so." She paused and looked around as if making sure they were alone. "You want to know about the veil, don't you? Everyone wants to know when they arrive." Matteo's heart skipped a beat. "It's not my place to ask about the princess." "No, it's not," the old woman conceded. "But I'll tell you anyway, because secrets kept too long rot like forgotten fruit in the pantry." And so as the afternoon died in golden tones over the palace gardens, Doña Margarita told him the truth about Isabel. "She was 16, the old woman began, her voice a thread of nostalgia, "and she was the jewel of Spain, beautiful as a dawn with a laugh that made even the old courtiers smile without realizing it. That night, the summer solstice festival, the Main, hall shone with 1,000 candles. Isabel wore an ivory-colored dress that made her look like an apparition." Doña Margarita paused, and her eyes moistened with the memory. No one knew how the fire started, perhaps a candle too close to a curtain, perhaps carelessness. The fact is that in minutes, flames were devouring the west wing. A maid, barely a girl, was trapped in the fire. Everyone screamed, but no one moved. The old woman swallowed. Except Isabel. Without thinking twice, she threw herself into the flames. She managed to get the girl out, but her voice broke. A burning curtain fell on her face. Matteo felt a shiver run down his spine. He could imagine the scene with painful clarity, the panic, the screams, the unbearable heat, and in the midst of it all, a young princess facing the fire with the courage many men would envy. "And her scars?" he dared to ask. "They are deep." Doña Margarita nodded. "But what few understand is that Isabel doesn't wear the veil out of shame. She wears it as a shield, as protection against those gazes of pity, of disguised horror, of morbid curiosity that hurt more than the flames themselves." At that moment, Matteo understood something fundamental about the princess. Her isolation wasn't weakness, but a form of strength. She wasn't hiding, she was protecting herself. "Since then," the old woman continued, "she's shut herself in an inner world. She speaks little, smiles less. But she observes, boy. She observes everything with those eyes that the fire couldn't extinguish." When Doña Margarita left, dragging her worn feet along the garden paths, Matteo remained motionless for a long while. The sun had set, and the first star of the night shone solitary in the sky like the princess in her tower of silence. That night, upon returning to his duties, something had changed in Matteo's gaze. When he crossed paths with Isabel in a hallway and lowered his eyes as protocol dictated, he no longer did so out of blind obedience, but out of a new respect born of understanding. And for a fleeting, almost imperceptible instant, it seemed to him that the princess slowed her pace, as if she too had felt that something invisible but profound had just changed between them. May brought with it an explosion of color to the gardens of the Palace of Santa Clara. The rose bushes, tended with devotion by gardeners who treated each bud as if it were a miniature prince, now offered their beauty in a symphony of reds, pinks, and whites. For Matteo, who had grown up among wheat fields where beauty was more austere, this abundance was almost overwhelming. One morning, while carrying firewood for the library's fireplace, a task he performed even when the weather no longer required it, as he knew the princess valued the crackling of the fire even on mild days, he saw something that was etched in his memory like a painting. Isabel alone in the gallery overlooking the rose garden, with one hand extended toward a ray of sunlight that passed through the stained glass. The princess wasn't wearing gloves, something unusual for her. Her fingers, fine and white, seemed to try to capture the light like someone trying to catch water in their hands. Through the veil, Matteo couldn't see her expression, but there was such vulnerability in that gesture that he felt as if he were witnessing something intimate, almost sacred. Without making a sound, he continued on his way, but that image awakened in him a tenderness he hadn't felt before. In the following days, Matteo began to notice small details about Isabel that had previously gone unnoticed, how her hands caressed the spines of books in the library before choosing one, how she always paused for a moment in front of her mother's portrait in the north hallway, how she seemed to hold her breath when music floated from the ballroom during the young page's lessons. One afternoon, while serving tea on the terrace where Isabel read in silence, Matteo made a mistake that would change everything. He dropped a silver spoon which produced a crystalline sound as it hit the porcelain. The princess raised her head from her book, and although he couldn't see her eyes through the black veil, Matteo felt her gaze fixed on him. "Do you like poetry?" he suddenly asked, forgetting all etiquette, all rules, all prudence. A silence as dense as winter fog settled between them. Doña Teresa, who was embroidering a few steps away, raised her head with a scandalized expression. Matteo felt the ground opening beneath his feet. He had just addressed the princess directly without being spoken to the most serious transgression. For a servant. Isabel remained motionless for what seemed an eternity. Then, with a barely perceptible gesture, she closed her book. "Withdraw," she said in a neutral voice, without anger but without warmth. That night, as expected, Matteo was called to the butler's office. His insolence cost him 3 days without pay and a temporary transfer to the kitchens away from the princess's presence. He accepted the punishment with dignity, knowing it could have been much worse. What he didn't expect, however, was the note he found under his door the following morning. On fine paper in an elegant handwriting that could only belong to one person, 7 words were written: "Do not fear silence, sometimes it's refuge." Matteo read and reread those words until he memorized them. They weren't signed, but it wasn't necessary. They were like a hand extended across an abyss, a fragile but real bridge over the void that separated their worlds. When 3 days later he returned to his usual duties, something had subtly changed. Isabel didn't mention the incident, nor did she directly answer his question about poetry. But one afternoon, while Matteo stoked the fire in the library, he noticed that on the table next to the princess's armchair there was a small volume of poems by St. John of the Cross, open precisely to "Dark Night of the Soul." It was a silent message, so subtle that anyone else might have overlooked it, but for Matteo, who had begun to read Isabel's silences like someone deciphering a text in a foreign language, the meaning was clear. Somewhere behind that black veil she too was seeking light in the darkness. The Palace of Santa Clara, like any living organism, had its own rhythms, moments of feverish activity, followed by periods of lethargy, days of bustle, and nights of sepulchral silence. Matteo had learned to move to the beat of these rhythms, to make himself visible or invisible as the occasion dictated. One night in late June, while returning from delivering firewood to the kitchens, a murmur of voices stopped him in his tracks. They came from the blue hall in the west wing, a chamber rarely used at that time of year. The door was ajar, and a strip of yellowish light spilled onto the hallway floor like liquid gold. Prudence dictated that he continue on his way. Curiosity, however, was stronger. With the stealth he had perfected in his months of service, Matteo approached the gap and listened. "Emotionally unstable," said a grave voice he recognized as that of Don Alfonso, Isabel's maternal uncle and a member of the royal council. "A woman who cannot show her face can hardly show the strength necessary to govern." "The king still trusts her," replied another voice, more shrill and nervous. "The king is old and sick," Don Alfonso replied impatiently, "and when he's gone, the council will have to make difficult decisions. A temporary regency would be most sensible until we find a suitable consort who can guide her." Matteo felt the blood freeze in his veins. He was not an expert in court intrigues, but he perfectly understood what he was hearing: a conspiracy to remove Isabel from the throne that legitimately belonged to her. "And if she resists?" asked a third voice. He couldn't identify. Don Alfonso let out a dry laugh devoid of humor. "Resist a creature who hides behind a veil, who trembles at the mere mention of her condition. It will be enough to pressure her a little. Everyone knows she isn't complete." "Even so, she has supporters," insisted the second man. "Supporters who will vanish like mist in the sun when we make her state public. I have commissioned trusted physicians to report on the effects of severe burns on mental stability. It will be convincing." Matteo backed away from the door, feeling nauseous. Not because of what he had heard — palace intrigues were as common as rats in barns — but because of the calculated cruelty with which those men planned to use Isabel's misfortune against her. For days, the knowledge of that conspiracy weighed on Matteo like a slab. Should he inform someone who the butler, the princess herself, information obtained through espionage, could turn against him? One afternoon, while serving tea to Isabel in the library where she usually retired after social gatherings, he observed her with new eyes. She wasn't just an injured woman hiding from the world. She was a potential queen, threatened by those who should protect her. "Your Highness," he dared to say once again, breaking protocol. Isabel lifted her head from her book. Through the black veil, Matteo felt her questioning gaze. The roses in the East Garden are especially beautiful this season." He continued using an improvised code. "Although I've noticed that some have hidden thorns." There was a silence. Then, to his surprise, Isabel closed her book and placed it on the table with a deliberately slow movement. "Thorns," she said in a clear and serene voice, "are usually visible to those who know how to look, Matteo." It was the first time the princess had called him by name, but more importantly, her answer made it clear that she had understood the implicit message. She already knew she was in danger. That night, from his room window, Matteo saw Isabel walking alone through the gardens, her dark figure outlined against the paleness of the rose bushes. She didn't seem frightened or downcast, but resolute. The princess of the black veil, he realized then, was not the fragile creature Don Alfonso believed. And perhaps, just perhaps, in that fortress of intrigues and shadows, he had found someone worth fighting for. July arrived, wrapped in stifling heat, and the announcement of a visit that altered the usual stillness of the palace of Santa Clara. Prince Rodrigo of Navarre, Isabel's betrothed since childhood by agreements between kingdoms, would arrive in 3 days to formally meet his future wife. The preparations plunged the palace into a frenzy Matteo had never witnessed. Servants running with clean sheets and fresh flowers, cooks heatedly debating menus, butlers inspecting every corner for the slightest defect. In the midst of that organized chaos, Isabel remained like an island of calm, though Matteo noticed that her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she turned the pages of her books. The morning of the arrival dawned with a sky of impeccable blue, as if even the elements wanted to honor the visitor. From his position in the music room, where he had been assigned to maintain the fire, a symbolic gesture given the heat, Matteo could partially observe the reception in the main courtyard. Prince Rodrigo descended from his carriage with the confidence of one who knows the world belongs to him by divine right. Tall, with dark hair and an aquiline profile, he wore clothes that shouted wealth without need for words. His smile, practiced to perfection, unfolded with calculated generosity as he greeted the courtiers. Then came the moment of the encounter with Isabel. The princess appeared at the top of the staircase, a slender figure wrapped in blue silk, her face hidden behind the black veil. There was a moment of absolute silence, as if everyone were holding their breath. Rodrigo ascended the steps and bowed before his betrothed with studied elegance. He took her gloved hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture that, from a distance, might seem gallant, but Matteo, who had learned to read the subtlest body language, saw the momentary rigidity in Isabel's shoulders, the way she withdrew her hand an instant before etiquette dictated. That night a ball was held in the prince's honor. From his post by one of the side doors, Matteo observed the scene: richly attired nobles spinning to the rhythm of the music, crystalline laughter rising toward the coffered ceilings, wine glasses gleaming like rubies under the light of hundreds of candles. Isabel and Rodrigo danced together, maintaining the exact distance that etiquette marked. He occasionally leaned in to whisper something to her. She responded with minimal head movements. To anyone's eyes, they were the image of the perfect royal couple, but Matteo could see the tension running through the princess's back, the way her hands closed tightly when she thought no one was watching her. "Wouldn't it be nice if we could see the face of our future queen?" commented a young marchioness loudly enough to be heard by several nearby groups. "A faceless bride is like a book without pages." The laughter that followed was like broken glass to Matteo. He saw how Isabel paused for a second, how her entire body seemed to contract under the weight of those cruel words. Then, with a dignity that made Matteo feel his chest constricted with admiration, the princess continued dancing, as if nothing had happened. Later, when the party began to wane, Matteo was sent to bring more candles to the adjoining hall. Upon returning, he crossed paths with Rodrigo and two nobles in a hallway. He didn't intend to eavesdrop, but the prince's words floated toward him with merciless clarity: "A ghost wife." Rodrigo laughed, his face reddened by wine. "But as long as she brings Navarre, as a dowry, I suppose I can bear not seeing her face on the pillow." That night, while extinguishing the last candles in the library, where Isabel usually retired after social gatherings, Matteo found her sitting by the window. The moonlight filtered through the veil, and for an instant he thought he saw the contour of her features. "Are masks of any use, Matteo?" she suddenly asked without turning. The question took him by surprise. "It depends on who wears them, Your Highness, and why." There was a prolonged silence. "Mine protect me," Isabel finally said, in a voice so low she almost seemed to be speaking to herself. "But what good is protection when what destroys comes from within?" Matteo didn't know how to respond. Words of consolation seemed insufficient, almost insulting in the face of such deep pain. "Roses also have thorns," he finally said, remembering their previous coded conversation. "Not out of vanity, but out of necessity." Isabel turned her head slightly toward him. Through the veil, Matteo felt, rather than saw, her gaze intense as a ray of sunlight passing through dark water. "Good night, Matteo," she said, with a new softness in her voice. "And thank you for the candles. Darkness is more bearable when one chooses one's own lights." As he withdrew, Matteo understood that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer simply princess and servant. They were two souls recognizing each other in the shared darkness, two solitudes that in some mysterious way began to illuminate each other. August unfurled its mantle of relentless heat over the gardens of the Palace of Santa Clara. The fountains, with their play of crystalline water, became coveted refuges for birds and courtiers alike. The afternoons stretched lazily, bathing the stone walls in a golden light that transformed the ordinary into extraordinary. It was in these twilight hours, when Isabel usually retired to the inner gardens, a space reserved exclusively for the royal family and a few privileged individuals. A labyrinth of hedges, statues, and rose bushes, arranged in concentric circles, that culminated in a small gazebo with a marble fountain. There, protected by the vegetation and the strict protocol that kept the curious at bay, the princess found respite from the stifling court etiquette. That particular afternoon, Matteo had been sent to fetch a book that Isabel had left forgotten in the gazebo. The butler gave him precise instructions: enter, take the book, leave. Without stopping, without looking around, without disturbing the possible presence of the princess. The sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains when Matteo entered the labyrinth. The scent of roses, intensified by the day's heat, floated in the air like an intoxicating perfume. He walked along the paths he already knew, hearing the crunch of gravel beneath his feet and the distant song of birds preparing for the night. Upon turning the last bend before the gazebo, a sound stopped him. The soft whisper of water and something else. A sigh cautiously, he peered between two cypresses that flanked the entrance. Isabel was there with her back to him, sitting on the edge of the fountain. Her hands, free from the usual gloves, played with the water-drawing circles that expanded and died to be reborn with each new movement. But what made Mateo's heart stop was not her presence, but what was missing: the veil. The princess, believing herself completely alone, had removed her black protection. Her hair, gathered in a simple braid, fell over her right shoulder like a river of dark silk. Mateo knew he should withdraw immediately. To contemplate the princess without her veil was the most serious transgression he could commit, an act that could cost him not only his position, but possibly his freedom. And yet his feet seemed anchored to the ground, unable to obey reason. At that moment, as if she had sensed his presence, Isabel turned her head slightly, not enough to reveal her full face, but enough for Mateo to glimpse the profile of her cheek and part of her jaw. The skin, marked by scars that descended like pale rivers over a reddish land, wordlessly told the story of that fire that had changed her life. Mateo held his breath, paralyzed between the desire to flee and a new overwhelming emotion that had no name. It was then that Isabel turned completely. Her eyes, a deep brown that Mateo had never been able to guess through the veil, opened in surprise and then narrowed in fury. Her face, marked by scars that ran mainly down the right side from temple to jaw, was like a map of pain and courage intertwined. But beyond the marks, what struck Mateo was the fierce beauty that emanated from her features, the perfect curve of her lips, the dignity in her gaze, the life pulsing beneath that skin that had known fire and survived to tell about it. "Out!" Isabel shouted quickly, covering herself with the veil she had left on the bench. "Out of my sight!" Mateo backed away, stumbling over a flower pot. "Your Highness, forgive me, I was only—" Isabel stood up, trembling with rage or shame or both. "Did you come to look to satisfy your curiosity about the monster?" "No," the word escaped Mateo's lips with such force that it surprised them both. "I would never think that of you, Your Highness." For an instant, something changed in Isabel's gaze. A crack in the armor of her anger, a flash of vulnerability. "Tonight," she said, in a controlled but trembling voice, "you will leave the palace. I never want to see you again." Mateo bowed his head, accepting the sentence. But as he was about to withdraw, words flowed from him without permission. "The scars don't make you less, Your Highness. They make you more real." Isabel remained motionless, the veil now in place, hiding any reaction. For a moment it seemed she would respond. Then, with an abrupt gesture of her hand, she indicated that he should leave. That night, as he gathered his few belongings, Mateo wondered if that had been the first and last time he would truly see Isabel. Not the physical scars which he now knew existed, but which did not define his vision of her, but the real person behind all the layers of reserve and isolation. When he was about to leave, a knock at his door startled him. It was Doña Margarita, the old woman who had told him Isabel's story. "The carriage that was to take you has had an accident on the way," she said without preamble. "It won't be able to arrive until tomorrow at noon." She paused and added with a significant look, "The princess has been informed, of course." Something in her tone made Mateo wonder if that accident had really been fortuitous, or if Isabel perhaps was giving him time for something, an opportunity to apologize, or simply the possibility of departing in daylight with a bit more dignity than a thief in the night. He didn't know. But as the moon rose over the palace, illuminating the same gardens where hours before his life had irrevocably changed, Mateo felt that something important, something that transcended the barriers between servant and princess, had begun to bloom. Something as fragile as it was valuable. And perhaps, just perhaps, not all was lost. The storm arrived at nightfall, sudden and furious, like the denouement of a long-announced tragedy. Lightning tore through the darkened sky, momentarily illuminating the palace with ghostly flashes that transformed the familiar into disturbing. The wind, enraged, lashed at windows and made the century-old beams groan as if the building itself protested against the violence of the elements. Mateo, who was to depart the next day, could not sleep. He tossed and turned in his narrow bed, tormented by images that repeated in his mind. Isabel's revealed face, the mixture of fury and vulnerability in her eyes, the sentence of expulsion that would end. End what exactly? A service, a barely nascent connection, a possibility that never had a name. Shortly after midnight, unable to bear the confinement of his room, he decided to take one last walk through the palace that had been his home for months. The corridors were deserted, occasionally illuminated by the lightning that filtered through the windows. The roar of thunder drowned out the sound of his footsteps, granting him a freedom of movement he had never before experienced. Almost without realizing it, his feet led him to the library, that space where he had shared so many silent moments with Isabel. He didn't expect to find anyone there at that hour, so surprise momentarily paralyzed him when, upon opening the door, he saw a figure sitting by the window silhouetted against the stormy sky. Isabel was motionless, contemplating the storm, and although the room was in semi-darkness, illuminated only by a small oil lamp and occasional lightning, Matteo could clearly see that she wasn't wearing the veil. His first instinct was to withdraw, silently, to avoid a confrontation that would only add pain to the imminent farewell. But before he could move, Isabel spoke without turning. "Don't run away, Matteo. You've already seen what there is to see." Her voice, devoid of the barrier of the veil, sounded different, clearer, younger, with nuances that the black fabric usually concealed. "Forgive me, Your Highness," he replied, remaining by the door, unsure. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "Disturb me?" Isabel emitted a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. "It's curious how words can be so inadequate. You don't disturb me. What disturbs me is what you represent." "And what do I represent, if I may ask?" A particularly intense lightning bolt illuminated the room, revealing for an instant Isabel's profile with cruel clarity. The scars that marked her skin were like a map of pain, but to Matteo's eyes they didn't diminish her beauty. They simply made it different, deeper. "The possibility," she replied after a long silence. "The dangerous possibility that there exists someone capable of looking at me without seeing only this." She vaguely gestured at her scarred face. "The possibility that there is something beyond the veil, beyond duties, beyond state commitments." Matteo took a step forward, then another, until he stood a few meters from her. "That possibility exists, Your Highness." Isabel then turned completely toward him. In the trembling lamplight, her eyes shone with a mixture of resignation and defiance. "Really?" she asked, with a vulnerability that contrasted with her usual reserve. "Can you look at me like this without reservations and not see a monster or an object of pity?" "I see Isabel," Matteo replied simply. "Not the princess, not the heir, not a symbol. I see the woman who runs into fire to save others, who endures cruel gazes with dignity, who finds refuge in books and silence. I see scars, yes, but I also see courage, and that Your Highness is more beautiful than any perfect face." The words floated between them like fallen leaves in a pond, creating invisible but real ripples. Isabel closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing what she had just heard. When she opened them again, there was a different light in them. "Come closer," she said in a barely audible voice. Matteo obeyed, reducing the distance between them until only a few spans separated them. Isabel extended a hand, a silent invitation that he accepted. Their fingers met, intertwined timidly at first, then with growing certainty. "I've been wondering for years," she whispered, looking at their joined hands, "if there would ever be someone capable of touching me like this, of looking at me like this." "We exist," he replied with contained fervor. "Perhaps we are few, perhaps we must search for each other in the darkness, but we exist." Outside, the storm was beginning to abate. The thunder, now more distant, marked the rhythm of a world that continued to turn oblivious to the small miracle that was occurring in that library. A world where a princess and a servant were figures destined for separate orbits, where tales of love between people of different classes invariably ended in tragedy. And yet there they were, defying with their closeness all the written and unwritten rules. Isabel, who had lived so long behind a veil, allowing herself to be truly seen for the first time. Matteo, a simple peasant, falsely accused, discovering that the most authentic beauty often bears the inscription of overcome pain. "I must leave tomorrow," he finally said, breaking the spell of the moment. Isabel nodded slowly. "I know, it's necessary. Will I see you again?" A sad smile curved the princess's lips. "Fate rarely consults our wishes, Matteo. But there are things that once found cannot be completely lost. She paused and added in a firmer voice, and there are decisions that only I can make. They remained like that, hands intertwined, gazes united, until the first rays of dawn began to filter through the window. A new day was dawning, bringing with it the inevitable separation, but also perhaps the germ of something that neither of them dared yet to name, but that was already flowering in the shared silence of that stormy night. Dawn brought with it a sky washed by the storm of such an intense blue that it seemed unreal. Matteo, with his few possessions packed, contemplated the gardens from his room window, trying to engrave in his memory every detail of the place he would soon leave behind. The preparations for his departure proceeded with the same silent efficiency that characterized all activities at Santa Clara. The carriage would arrive at noon. His duties had already been reassigned. His presence in the palace was beginning to dilute even before his physical departure. What Matteo didn't know was that while he contemplated the garden, other eyes had been watching him. Doña Teresa, Isabel's lady, in waiting usually as discreet as a shadow, had by chance witnessed that nocturnal encounter in the library. Not everything, but enough: the intertwined hands, the complicit gazes, the princess without her veil, allowing a servant to contemplate her in a way that transcended all barriers of protocol and class. Teresa was not a cruel woman by nature. She had faithfully served Isabel for years, protecting her privacy, respecting her pain. But in her heart lodged a thorn long ignored, the conviction that she would never be seen, never valued beyond her function. And the vision of Isabel, disfigured, yes, but princess nonetheless, receiving the devotion that had always been denied to her, awakened a resentment she didn't even know she harbored. That morning, while Matteo was packing, Teresa slipped a note under the door of Don Alfonso's office. The peasant and the princess share more than silences. Last night in the library. Without veil, without barriers, without honor. T. The consequences were not long in coming. Shortly before noon, when Matteo was already preparing to head to the courtyard where the carriage should be waiting for him, 2 guards appeared at his door. Mateo Sanchez, said the higher-ranking one, a man with a stony face and eyes that revealed no emotion, "You are arrested by order of the Royal Council under the accusation of attacking the honor of Her Royal Highness Princess Isabel." What? Matteo's incredulity was genuine. The encounter in the library had been intimate, yes, but chaste. An exchange of glances and words, the brush of hands, nothing that could be considered dishonorable. There must be a mistake. The mistake, intervened a voice from the threshold, was believing that a servant could rise above his condition. Don Alfonso entered the room with the satisfaction of a hunter before a long-pursued prey. His face, usually composed in a mask of cold courtesy, now showed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We have a witness," he continued, "who saw you last night with the princess in compromising circumstances." "That's false," Matteo protested, as the guard seized his arms. "The princess and I simply talked." Simply, Don Alfonso's voice distilled sweet venom. "Does it seem simple to you that a peasant directly addresses the heir to the throne, that he contemplates her without her veil, that he touches her hand?" Matteo's blood froze in his veins. Someone had seen then. Someone had betrayed that sacred moment. There was no dishonor, he insisted, though he knew his words would fall on deaf ears. "The council will decide that," Don Alfonso sentenced. "Meanwhile, you will be assigned a cell befitting your merits." As the guards escorted him through corridors, he had freely traveled. Until yesterday, Matteo looked for any trace of Isabel. Would she know what was happening? Could she do anything to stop it? What he didn't know was that at that very moment the princess was being conducted to her chambers with strict orders not to leave them. Doña Teresa, with the pale face of one who begins to understand the consequences of her actions, informed her that the council had decided to seclude her for her own safety. "What has happened?" Isabel demanded to know, with an authority that momentarily made her lady-in-waiting step back. Teresa lowered her gaze, unable to face the intensity of those eyes that, even partially hidden behind the veil, seemed to penetrate to her soul. They have arrested Mateo Sanchez," she murmured, "for attacking your honor." Isabel remained, motionless, as if struck by an invisible lightning bolt. Then, with an abrupt movement that startled Teresa, she tore off the veil. "My honor." Her voice was barely a whisper, but charged with a contained fury that made the lady tremble. "What does anyone know of my honor? What does anyone know of me?" Her eyes, now fully visible, shone with a determination that Teresa had never seen in her. At that moment she understood with painful clarity that she had fatally underestimated her mistress. This was not the face of a woman broken by fear and insecurity. It was the face of a queen ready to fight. "Doña Teresa," Isabel said in a controlled voice, each word measured like drops of a precise poison. "I have reason to believe that you know more than you say about this matter." The lady took a step back, paling even more. "Your Highness, I'm not interested in your justifications," Isabel cut her off. "I only want to know one thing. Was it you who informed the council?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Isabel nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already knew. "I understand," she said with a calmness that was more terrifying than any outburst of anger. "Now I want you to understand something. This isn't over, and when it ends, each will be in the place they deserve." Meanwhile, in a cell in the lower levels of the palace, Matteo contemplated through a small barred window the same blue sky he had admired that morning. But now he saw something else: the tower where Isabel's chambers were located. And although it seemed impossible, he almost thought he could make out a figure in one of the windows, looking in his direction. Something told him this wasn't the end, but the beginning of a battle in which a veiled princess and an accused servant would face the same forces that had tried to keep them apart. And for the first time since his arrest, Matteo felt that hope, that fragile flame that all the powers of the world could not extinguish, was beginning to burn again in his chest. The Royal Council chamber, located in the north wing of the Palace of Santa Clara, was a space conceived to impress and, when necessary, intimidate. Tall windows let in light in precise beams that seemed to strategically illuminate the center of the room where the accused had to face their destiny. Portraits of past monarchs watched from the walls with severe gazes, as if even from death they continued to judge the living. Matteo was taken there 3 days after his arrest. 3 days of solitude, interrupted only by the visits of a guard, who brought him food, and Doña Margarita, who surprisingly had obtained permission to see him briefly. The old woman hadn't said much, limiting herself to whispering to him, "Have faith. She hasn't forgotten you." Enigmatic words that now resonated in his mind as he entered the room, flanked by 2 guards. The full royal council was present, 12 men in rigorous dark attire, seated behind a long, polished wooden table. In the center, occupying a slightly elevated chair, Don Alfonso presided in the absence of the king, whose health had deteriorated in recent weeks. "Matteo Sanchez," Don Alfonso began in a voice that pretended to be solemn but betrayed satisfaction, "you appear before this council accused of very serious crimes against the crown, namely, abuse of trust, intrusion into Her Royal Highness's privacy, and, most seriously, undue influence over the princess heir to the throne." Murmurs ran through the room, where besides the councillors, some privileged courtiers had gathered, eager to witness the spectacle of others' disgrace. "How do you plead?" Don Alfonso continued. Matteo, who had kept his gaze lowered until that moment, lifted his head with a dignity that surprised many of those present. "I plead innocent of any intention to harm Her Highness," he responded in a clear voice. "If my presence, my words, or my actions have caused her any harm, I deeply regret it, but there was never dishonor in my heart toward her." Don Alfonso smiled with disdain. "Noble sentiments for a simple servant. However, it is not your heart we judge, but your actions. We have testimony that you were found in the library with the princess alone in the middle of the night. That you observed her without her veil against all rule and decency. That you held her hand, gravely transgressing your position." The murmur intensified. Matteo maintained his composure, though inside he felt his world crumbling. Each private moment, each glance, each gesture shared with Isabel was now exposed, distorted, turned into something sordid by the malice of those who could never understand. "Do you deny these facts?" Don Alfonso pressed. "I do not deny that I was with Her Highness," Matteo responded. "I deny that there was indecency or dishonor in our encounter." "The indecency was in your mere presence there," exclaimed one of the councillors, a man with ruddy cheeks and small porcine eyes, a peasant, a servant daring to look at the princess as if she were his equal. "And are we not all equal before God?" The question escaped Matteo's lips before he could contain it. There was a sepulchral silence. Don Alfonso leaned forward with the expression of one who has received exactly what he expected. "Blasphemy and sedition," he murmured with barely disguised satisfaction. "You have dug your own grave, Sanchez." It was at that precise moment when the doors of the room opened, with a bang making all heads turn toward the entrance. Isabel of Bourbon and Savoy, Princess of Spain, and heir to the throne, advanced down the central aisle with firm step. But what provoked the real commotion was not her unexpected presence, but what was missing the veil. For the first time in years, Isabel presented herself in public, with her face uncovered, allowing everyone to contemplate the scars that had marked her flesh, but not her spirit. An absolute silence fell over the room, so dense it could almost be touched. Matteo, as surprised as everyone else, held his breath. Isabel, however, walked with her head high, her eyes fixed on the council, deliberately ignoring the gazes of horror, pity, or morbid curiosity that followed her. "What is the meaning of this?" Don Alfonso finally managed to articulate, rising from his seat. "Your Highness, you should be—" "Confined," Isabel completed, "hidden, silenced while you decide about my honor and my life." She reached Matteo's side, to whom she directed a brief glance that contained 1,000 unspoken words. Then she turned to the council. "Gentlemen councillors," she began with a calmness that contrasted with the tension in the environment, "I come to speak in defense of this man whom you falsely accuse." "Your Highness," Don Alfonso intervened, recovering part of his composure, "we appreciate your concern, but this matter must be treated with due discretion. Your presence here in these conditions is not appropriate." "Conditions?" Isabel sketched a sad smile. "Are you referring to my face, uncle? To these marks that you are so determined to hide, not for my good, but because their sight discomforts you?" Another murmur ran through the room, this one more intense. Isabel continued, imperturbable. "For years I have accepted the veil. Not out of shame, but out of compassion for those who could not bear the sight of what the fire did to me. I have lived in the shadows so that others could feel comfortable in the light." She paused, and her eyes swept the room. But no more. She turned to Matteo, and in a gesture that scandalized the entire assembly, took his hand in hers. "This man," she said in a voice that gained strength with each word, "is the only one in this palace who has truly seen me. Not my scars, not my title, but me. And yes, I confess before all of you that I love him. Not as a princess loves a subject, but as a woman loves a man who has known how to see the light in her darkness." The silence that followed this declaration was absolute. Matteo, with his heart beating so hard he feared everyone could hear it, gently squeezed Isabel's hand, a minimal gesture but loaded with meaning. Don Alfonso was the first to recover his voice. This confirms our worst suspicions," he stammered, trying to capitalize on the situation. "The princess is not in her right mind. This man has exerted a pernicious influence over her, taking advantage of her vulnerability and—" "Enough," Isabel interrupted him, no longer with calmness but with authority. "Enough of manipulations, uncle. I know perfectly well what you were planning: to use my condition, my pain, as a tool to remove me from the throne, declare me unstable, incompetent to govern, and then you yourself would assume the power you so covet." The gazes of the councillors oscillated between Isabel and Don Alfonso, uncertain of whom to believe, which side to take. The princess, perceiving their hesitation, delivered the final blow. "I propose that my father the king decide on this matter." Directly, without interested intermediaries. There was a tense silence. Appealing to the king was a risky move. Carlos III rarely intervened anymore in matters of state due to his waning health. But he was still the monarch, and his word was law. Don Alfonso, cornered, attempted a last resistance. "His Majesty is not in a condition to receive these disturbing news. His health is fragile and—" "My father is much stronger than you believe," Isabel cut him off, "and he has the right to know how his brother tries to usurp his daughter's power." With these words, the princess turned and, still holding Matteo's hand, began to walk toward the exit. No one dared to stop her. Don Alfonso, with his face disfigured by contained rage, let himself fall heavily into his chair as the room erupted into chaos of voices and speculations. The trial was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The Sun Chamber King Carlos's private office owed its name to the large east-facing windows that flooded the room with golden light during mornings. It was an austere space by royal standards, reflecting the practical character of the monarch. Few ornaments, many books detailed maps of the kingdom's provinces, and a massive desk that had supported the weight of decisions affecting millions of lives. Matteo had never imagined he would enter that legendary precinct, much less in the current circumstances, conducted by royal guards preceded by Isabel, who walked with the dignity of one who has decided that she no longer has anything to hide. Her face, exposed to everyone's gaze after years veiled, showed the scars of fire with the same naturalness with which others would show inherited jewels. King Carlos awaited them seated behind his desk. The years and illness had reduced his bulk, but his eyes, so similar to his daughter's, retained the sharpness and determination that had characterized his reign. At his side stood his personal secretary, a thin and silent man whose expression revealed no emotion, and completing the picture, Don Alfonso, who had arrived earlier and had evidently taken the opportunity to present his version of events. When Isabel entered, the king sat up slightly. For a moment, something like surprise crossed his face upon seeing his daughter without the veil. Then, regaining his composure, he gestured to the guards to withdraw. "Isabel." His voice was deep, but tired. "I didn't expect to see you like this." "It was time, father," she replied, holding his gaze. "Time to stop hiding." Carlos nodded slowly, as if assimilating this new reality. Then his eyes fell on Matteo, evaluating him with the intensity of one who has spent a lifetime judging men. "And this is the servant," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "The one who, according to your uncle, has exerted an improper influence over you." Before Isabel could respond, Matteo stepped forward. In any other circumstance, addressing the king directly without being spoken to would have been an unforgivable transgression, but he had crossed so many lines that one more hardly mattered. "Your Majesty," he said in a voice that to his own surprise sounded firm, "if loving the light in your daughter beyond her title or appearance is improper, then I am guilty. But there is no intention in my heart other than to honor her as she deserves. To be honored as a woman of incomparable value, not as a symbol or possession." A tense silence followed these words. Don Alfonso, positioned to the king's left, had his face contracted in a grimace of barely contained indignation. "This is intolerable," he finally exclaimed. "A peasant, a servant, speaking of loving the princess heir. It's sedition, it's—" "Silence." The king's order, though pronounced without raising his voice, fell like an axe. Carlos rose from his seat with some difficulty and walked until he stood in front of Isabel. With almost reverent gentleness, he extended a hand toward his daughter's face, tracing with trembling fingers the contour of the scars. "Beautiful and terrible," he murmured more to himself than to those present, "like life itself." Then he turned to Don Alfonso, and his expression hardened. "Did you really think I wouldn't see through your machinations, brother? That I wouldn't understand that you were using my daughter's pain as a tool for your ambitions?" Don Alfonso's face lost all color. "Your Majesty, I was only trying to protect the interests of the crown, the stability of the kingdom." "Enough," Carlos cut him off. "I banish you from the court, Alfonso. You will return to your lands in Valencia and will not set foot in the palace as long as I live." Isabel observed her father with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. She had never seen him take such a firm position in her defense. "And as for you," the king continued, turning to Matteo, "I cannot punish you for seeing in my daughter what others, including myself, have often been unable to see." He paused, and his expression turned thoughtful. "However, I also cannot ignore reality. Your presence in the palace is incompatible with Isabel's position as heir to the throne." Matteo's heart sank. Despite everything, despite having been understood, even forgiven, the final result would be the same separation. "You must depart," the king confirmed, "not as punishment but as a painful yet inescapable necessity." Isabel stepped forward, taking her father's hand in hers. "And if I renounce," she asked in a clear voice, "and if I abdicate my right to the throne?" A gasp escaped Don Alfonso's lips. Carlos looked at his daughter for a long time with a mixture of sadness and pride. "Would you renounce everything for this man?" he finally asked. "I would renounce everything for myself, father," Isabel replied. "To live a life where I don't have to hide, where I can love freely, where my value doesn't depend on my political utility." Carlos closed his eyes for a moment, as if the weight of the crown had suddenly become heavier on his head. When he opened them again, there was a calm resolution in them. "The future of the kingdom is important," he said slowly, "but so is the soul of my daughter." He looked at Matteo, then at Isabel, and finally added, "I will not ask you to choose today, Isabel, nor will I force you into a marriage you repudiate. The engagement with Prince Rodrigo is annulled." Don Alfonso seemed about to faint. The secretary, imperturbable until that moment, raised his eyebrows in a gesture of contained surprise. "But, Your Majesty," Alfonso stammered, "the alliance with Navarre—" "Other paths will be found for the alliance," Carlos decreed. "The crown can wait, the soul cannot." That night, as Matteo again prepared for his departure, this time not as a criminal but as someone pardoned, yet still separated from what he loved, a message arrived at his room. Not a written note, but a small object, a key. And with it verbal instructions transmitted by Doña Margarita, the north entrance of the gardens at dawn. The sun had barely begun to paint the horizon in pinkish tones when Matteo arrived at the indicated spot. A solitary figure awaited him beside a small wrought-iron door, almost hidden among vines. Isabel without veil, in a simple travel dress, and with a small bag. "Are you sure?" Matteo asked, knowing exactly what that image meant. Isabel nodded. "My father has given me 3 months to decide," she explained. 3 months to choose between the crown and another life. "A life with me," Matteo completed, hardly daring to believe it. "A life of my own," Isabel gently corrected, "that I want to share with you." They looked at each other in silence, conscious of the weight and fragility of the moment. Then, with the resolution of those who have made a decision that will change the course of their existence together, they opened the small door that led outside the palace grounds toward an uncertain but their own future. The scene on the main staircase of the Palace of Santa Clara would remain etched in the memory of all present, like a living painting of farewell and dignity. Matteo, dressed in simple but clean clothes that marked his return to the condition of a free man, descended the steps with slow but firm pace. Halfway down, a figure awaited him. Isabel again, with the veil, but somehow different, as if that piece of black fabric was no longer a prison, but simply a garment that could be put on or taken off according to her will. Courtiers and servants observed, from a distance kept at bay by an invisible cordon of respect or perhaps simple curiosity. Don Alfonso had already departed for his exile in Valencia, but his shadow seemed to remain in the corners of the palace, in the whispers that ran from mouth to mouth about the princess and the servant, about decisions to be made and paths to be traveled. When Matteo reached Isabel, there was no embrace or kiss. Such gestures would have been unthinkable in that environment. Instead, their hands met briefly, a fleeting contact, but loaded with promises. "The king has arranged a pension for you," said Isabel, loudly enough to be heard by those who were closest, but with an intimacy in her tone that transformed the official words into something personal. "For services rendered to the crown." "I am grateful for His Majesty's generosity," Matteo responded with equal formality. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "And yours, Your Highness, for everything." Through the veil, Matteo couldn't see her expression, but he felt the intensity of her gaze. There was so much they wished to say to each other, so many words that remained trapped between the rigid norms of etiquette and the presence of observers. And yet, in that shared silence, there was a deeper communication than many conversations. "I will wait for you," Isabel finally whispered, so low that only Matteo could hear her, "where there are no walls or shadows." "And I will be there," he responded with equal discretion, "every day until you arrive." One last handshake, one last exchange of gazes through the veil, and the separation became effective. Matteo continued descending the steps to the carriage that would take him far from Santa Clara. Before getting in, he turned one last time toward Isabel, who remained motionless on the staircase, like a statue wrapped in black silk. "Love is not begged for, your highness," he said loud enough for her to hear, but not the others. "It is honored." Isabel slightly inclined her head, a gesture that might seem like a simple, courteous farewell to any observer, but that for Matteo contained all the answer he needed. The journey to the small Castilian village that the king had suggested as a destination, far enough to avoid gossip, close enough to allow occasional communication, passed in a silence punctuated by memories. Matteo relived every moment shared with Isabel, the first exchange of glances in the library, the veiled conversations about poetry, the storm that had truly united them, her courage in presenting herself without the veil before the council, the tenderness, in the king's eyes, as he freed them both from an imposed destiny. The village, when he finally arrived 3 days later, turned out to be exactly what its name suggested, a place of rest. Small, quiet, composed of grey stone houses that seemed to sprout directly from the Castilian earth. A place where no one asked questions about the past, where a stranger could integrate without major difficulties, where the rhythm of life followed the course of the seasons rather than that of court intrigues. With the pension assigned by the king, Matteo was able to acquire a small house on the outskirts and a piece of land to cultivate. It wasn't very different from the life he had led before his unjust condemnation, and yet everything had changed. He was no longer the same man who had entered through the side door of the Palace of Santa Clara months ago. His hands were still rough from work, but his heart had known a type of nobility that no title could confer. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Matteo established a routine. He worked the land at dawn when dew still covered the fields. Like silver tears, he bought what was necessary in the village at noon, exchanging few words but kind gestures with his neighbors, and at dusk invariably he walked to a small hill from where the main road could be seen. There he sat sometimes for hours with his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he could make appear by the pure force of his desire the figure he awaited. To his surprise, 2 weeks after his arrival, Doña Margarita appeared in the village. The old woman with the secret blessing of the king had retired there with a widowed niece. They settled in a house near Matteo's, and soon a routine of evening visits was established between them, in which, without directly mentioning it, both found consolation in the shared weight. The 3-month period that the king had granted Isabel for her decision was drawing to a close. Matteo tried not to count the days, not to cling too much to hopes, but each dawn brought with it the unasked question, would it be today? And then, when summer was beginning to fade into the first ochre tones of autumn, it happened. Matteo was on the hill as on so many other afternoons, contemplating how the setting sun tinged the wheat fields with gold. It was Doña Margarita who saw it first, a solitary rider advancing along the main road. A rider who, as he approached, revealed himself to be a woman. "It's her," whispered the old woman with tears in her eyes. And indeed it was Isabel, not the princess heir, not the veiled and distant figure of the palace, but simply Isabel, a woman on a horse without entourage, without escort, with nothing suggesting her rank except the innate elegance of her movements, and most surprisingly without veil. Matteo stood up, unable to move beyond that. He felt his heart beating with such force that he feared it might escape from his chest. He watched her dismount gracefully in front of the village, where some inhabitants were already beginning to gather, attracted by the unusual visit. He saw her advance among them, responding to their bows with nods of her head, until she reached the foot of the hill where he waited. The last rays of the sun illuminated her face, the scars visible to all but somehow transformed. They were no longer marks of destruction, but testimonies of survival. Not disfigurations, but features as much her own as the color of her eyes or the curve of her lips. Isabel ascended the hill with firm step, stopping a few paces from Matteo. They looked at each other in silence, drinking in each other's presence, like the thirsty at an oasis. "I have chosen," she finally said in a clear voice that carried echoes of the princess she had been, but also new, freer tonalities. Matteo did not respond with words. Instead, he extended his hand, an echo of that gesture in the library during the stormy night, and Isabella's then took it in hers. From the village, the inhabitants observed the scene without fully understanding its meaning. They saw a man and a woman atop a hill, silhouetted against the evening sky, intertwined hands and gazes that spoke a language that transcended words. Only Doña Margarita, who had begun the descent with slow but determined step, truly understood what she was witnessing, not the end of a story, but the true beginning of one that against all odds had found its way beyond veils, walls and crowns. Troyes' small village in Castile. 7 years later, the light stone house stood on a gentle hill on the outskirts of the village, neither too close nor too far like its owners themselves. With its solid walls and generous windows, it seemed to have grown naturally from the surrounding landscape. A simple but carefully designed garden surrounded it with flowers in summer and hardy vegetation that retained some green even during the rigorous Castilian winters. For the villagers, that house and its inhabitants now formed an inseparable part of the landscape, integrated into the community, but always maintaining a certain air of mystery. Lady Isabel, no one called her anything, else though some elders still whispered that she had once been a princess, was respected by all. Her scars, visible but never hidden, had long ceased to provoke curious glances. Her natural dignity, combined with an acquired simplicity, inspired a confidence that no noble title could have conferred. That spring morning, Mateo was working in his garden when he heard the laughter of Francisco. His 7-year-old son mingled with Doña Margarita's grave voice. Despite her years, which now exceeded 80, the old woman retained a surprising vitality, especially when it came to narrating stories to the little boy who always listened with wondrous eyes. And then the knight faced the dragon with nothing but his shield. Doña Margarita's voice floated in the still morning air. Without a sword? Francisco's incredulous question made Mateo smile. Without a sword, the old woman confirmed, because sometimes, my dear, the best defense is not to attack, but to protect what we love. Mateo left the hoe leaning against a tree and headed toward the house. Upon entering, the familiar aroma of freshly baked bread greeted him like an embrace. Isabel was in the kitchen, holding in her arms little Maria, born just 3 months ago. The child slept peacefully, oblivious to the world around her. I think Francisco will soon ask for a shield, Mateo commented, approaching to place a kiss on his daughter's forehead and then on Isabel's lips. Doña Margarita is telling him stories of chivalry again. Isabel smiled, and as always when she did, Mateo felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. Children need stories, she replied, gently rocking Maria. I grew up among tales of princesses locked in towers. I prefer our son to learn about knights who protect without violence. They looked at each other in silence for a moment, a habit they had developed over the years, pauses in which both seemed to reconnect, to remember everything lived, everything overcome. A letter arrived from your father, Mateo finally said, pulling a crumpled envelope from his pocket. Doña Teresa brought it this morning while you were sleeping. Isabel's former lady-in-waiting reconciled with her, after years of letters of repentance, now occasionally served as a messenger between the king and his daughter. Carlos, now too weakened to travel, but still with a lucid mind, maintained regular correspondence with Isabel, despite the fact that she had never returned to the palace. The only time she had set foot again in Santa Clara was 3 years after her departure, when her father fell gravely ill. Isabel went alone, leaving Mateo and little Francisco at home. She spent 3 days by the king's bedside, in a silent but profound reconciliation. When Carlos recovered against all medical prognosis, many attributed it to his daughter's visit. The farewell between them, as Isabel later recounted, had been serene. A father who finally understood his daughter, a daughter who finally forgave her father. Isabel took the letter with her free hand and placed it on the table. I'll read it tonight, she said with a smile. Right now my hands are quite full. As if responding to her words, little Maria stirred in her arms, opening her eyes, identical to her mother's, for an instant before submerging again into sleep. Isabel, Mateo began with that tone she had learned to recognize as a prelude to an important conversation. Do you ever regret it? Your choice, I mean. It was a question he hadn't asked in years, not since that afternoon when she had arrived at the village, leaving behind crowns and obligations. She had written a letter of abdication with a phrase that ended up being quoted in salons and taverns alike. Power that forces one to hide the soul is not a power worth having. Isabel looked around the simple but cozy kitchen, Francisco's drawings. Pinned to the wall, the sound of laughter coming from the garden, the warm weight of her daughter in her arms. Then she looked at Mateo, the man who had seen beyond the veil, beyond the scars, beyond the title. "My only crown," she replied in a soft but firm voice, "is the one that no one can see or take away the freedom to be who I am without apologies or explanations." Together they looked out the window toward the garden, where Francisco ran among the rose bushes, while Doña Margarita, seated on a stone bench, wove stories as colorful as the flowers surrounding them. The boy with his dark hair so similar to Isabel's, and his clear eyes inherited from Mateo, was the perfect fusion of both, not only physically, but in spirit. He had his mother's natural dignity and his father's innate kindness. "The crown was a duty," Isabel continued, gently rocking Maria. "This is a gift. Each day here is worth 1,000 in that palace." Mateo put his arm around Isabel's shoulders, feeling under his fingers the texture of the simple fabric, now worn by one who once wore silks and brocades. "Sometimes I wonder what would have become of us if there hadn't been a storm that night, if I hadn't dared to enter the library." Isabel smiled with that mixture of sweetness and wisdom that the years with him had cultivated. "Some storms don't destroy Mateo. Some clear the sky so we can see the stars more clearly." The letter on the table with the royal seal barely visible, on the envelope worn by travel, was a tangible reminder of the world they had left behind. Don Alfonso had died 3 winters ago, alone and forgotten on his Valencian lands. King Carlos had lived much longer than the doctors had predicted, as if the reconciliation with his daughter had granted him renewed strength. Prince Rodrigo of Navarre had married a French duchess in an alliance that turned out to be as cold as his, with Isabel, would have been. This news reached them like echoes of a previous life, fragments of a tapestry that no longer belonged to them, but that they had helped to weave. In the village, few knew the true story of the scarred woman and her peasant husband. For most, they were simply Isabel and Mateo, kind people who cultivated their own food, cared for their children, and occasionally helped those in need. Isabel had established a small school where she taught village children to read, while Mateo shared his agricultural knowledge with whoever wanted to learn. "Dad, Mum, come see." Francisco's enthusiastic voice pulled them from their thoughts. The boy was holding something in his hands with infinite care. They went out together to the garden, where spring was displaying its magic in every new bud. Francisco came running, but reduced his pace upon remembering that his sister was sleeping in his mother's arms. "Look," he whispered, opening his hands to reveal a blue-winged butterfly resting peacefully on his palm. "Doña Margarita says it was hurt, but it will heal if we take care of it." Isabel knelt carefully to observe, better keeping Maria protected against her chest. "It's beautiful, Francisco, and very brave to trust you, like you trusted Dad." The boy responded with that surprising intuition he sometimes showed. "Doña Margarita told me that you were also hurt, but that you healed because you found someone who really saw you." Isabel and Mateo exchanged a glance in which surprise and emotion mingled. They had never hidden from their son the story of how they met, but they had simplified it, leaving the more complex details for when he was older. "That's right," Isabel confirmed, caressing Francisco's hair with her free hand. "The wounds that can be seen are the easiest to heal. It's the invisible ones that need a special gaze to heal." The butterfly in Francisco's hands slightly fluttered, its wings as if testing its strength. Then, in a surprisingly decisive movement, it took flight and rose in spirals over the garden before disappearing into the blue of the sky. "It flew!" exclaimed the boy, his eyes bright with joy. "It healed and it flew." "Sometimes," said Mateo, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, "all we need is a safe place to recover our strength and someone who believes we can fly again." They sat on the garden bench, the complete family alongside, Doña Margarita contemplating how the afternoon sun bathed the surrounding fields in a golden light that transformed the ordinary into extraordinary. The old woman knitted while telling stories of princesses who saved themselves and peasants with noble hearts. Francisco listened absorbed, lying on the grass, while Maria slept peacefully, passing from her mother's arms to her father's in a fluid and natural exchange. At some point, Isabel took Mateo's hand in hers. Her fingers, once soft as befitted a princess, now showed the marks of work and real life. She no longer wore rings or jewels. Her only adornment was a simple silver band that matched his. "You know," she said quietly, just for his ears, "that night in the library when you asked me if I would see you again, something in me already knew the answer." "And what was it?" he asked, though he believed he knew it. "That no matter how many walls, how much distance, or how many impossibilities stood between us," she replied gently, squeezing his hand, "some souls are destined to find each other, to recognize each other, to heal together. And when that happens, neither kingdoms nor crowns can separate what love has united." In the distance on the horizon, where the mountains were silhouetted against the evening sky, one could guess the diffuse silhouette of the palace of Santa Clara. From here it seemed small, almost insignificant, compared to the vastness of the landscape. Isabel looked at it briefly, without nostalgia or resentment, as one looks at a closed chapter of a book that has already been finished reading. Then she turned her gaze to her family, Mateo, whose eyes reflected the same devotion as on the first day, Francisco, so full of life and curiosity, little Maria, who was beginning to wake from her sleep with small sighs, and Doña Margarita, who had chosen to follow them on this alternative path. This was her true crown, her true kingdom, not one of stone and protocols, but one built with love and freedom. When the sun began to set, tinting the sky in orange and purple tones, they went into the house together. Dinner was simple but abundant, with freshly baked bread, village cheese, and vegetables from their own garden. They ate amid laughter and conversations, without enforced silences or rigid etiquette. Later, while Mateo put Francisco to bed and Doña Margarita retired to her room, Isabel sat by the window with Maria in her arms. The child, now awake, looked at her with those eyes that seemed to contain all the wisdom of the world. "Someday I will tell you our story," Isabel whispered to her, caressing her small cheek. "I will tell you about veils and fires, about gardens and libraries, about how your father saw me when no one else could. And above all, my little one, I will teach you that true scars are not those that are seen, but those that are hidden, and that true love is not that which ignores our wounds, but that which honors them as part of who we are." Mateo returned at that moment, and together they contemplated their daughter, this miracle born of a love that had defied all odds. "It's strange," he commented, "how paths that seem wrong sometimes lead us exactly where we needed to be." Isabel nodded, remembering that moment when she had arrived at the village with her heart beating strongly, but without doubts in her decision. "There are no veils here," she said simply. "No walls, no insurmountable distances, no enforced silences. Just us," Mateo completed, "as we are." And as the first star appeared in the night sky, Isabel understood with perfect clarity that true nobility had never resided in titles or palaces, but in the capacity to love with honesty, to see beyond appearances, to choose freedom even though the path was difficult. The princess she had been, and the woman she had become, finally found peace in this certainty that scars both visible and invisible were not marks of what they had lost, but maps of what they had found. "Beyond the veil," she whispered, as Maria began to sleep again, "is the life we choose to live, and that my little one is the only one that really matters." Mateo sat beside her, surrounding her with his arm, and so, in the stillness of that Castilian night, two souls that had learned to truly see each other continued their joint journey, not as princess and servant, but simply as Isabel and Mateo, two beings who had discovered that the deepest love is not born from perfection, but from acceptance, not from superficial admiration, but from recognition of the value that dwells in the depths of each human being. "I see you," he whispered, a phrase that had become their most intimate declaration of love over the years. "And I you," she responded, completing the ritual. "Because in the end, isn't that what we all yearn for? To be seen, truly seen, beyond our veils, beyond our scars, beyond the masks that the world forces us to wear. And in that mutual recognition, to find not only love but the freedom to be fully who we are meant to be.